Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest in our series of NUITEQ Snowflake webinars. Tonight, Danielle Macklin will be leading you in a discussion of using Snowflake for social emotional learning. As always, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions tab, and I will interrupt Danielle at an opportune time to ask her the question. And we welcome your questions, as we always welcome your questions. So the other thing that we would like to remind you of is if you have any type of topics that you would like us to cover, please let us know what those are. You can drop those in the questions tab also, or the chat tab. And you can also email us at jr, that's my name, Jack Reed, jr@nuitec.com. So without chatting any further, Danielle, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Jack. So today we're going to discuss how to use Snowflake for social emotional learning. And before we get into ways that you can use Snowflake, I want to talk a little bit about some of the background of social emotional learning. So most of the information I'm presenting today is going to come from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. And what social emotional learning is, it's your ability as a human, as whether it be a student, a teacher, an adult, whatever it is, it's your ability to understand and manage your emotions. It also refers to ability to set and achieve goals, to have empathy for others, and to have positive relationships, as well as engage in responsible decision-making. Now, for a long time in education, this tended to be viewed as those soft skills that weren't necessarily directly or explicitly taught to students, but were just incorporated in the way a teacher would teach, making sure they're addressing some of those emotional needs. As education's progressed, we're realizing that a lot of students have some deficiencies in social emotional learning. And even as adults, it's good for us to make sure that we are in tune with some of our social emotional intelligences so that we can be kind of the best version of ourselves. So with social emotional learning, we see it divided into 5 core competence areas. The first one being self-awareness. So self-awareness is a person's ability to understand and identify their own emotions. It's being able to recognize, I feel sad today, or I feel frustrated, or I feel overwhelmed, or super excited, or whatever the emotion may be. Being able to recognize that, and also being able to recognize a person's own strengths, as well as any of their limitations or challenges. So in a classroom setting, you probably hear students often say things like, I'm just not good at whatever the skill or the subject or whatever it is that they're struggling with. And with developing social emotional learning for self-awareness, this is going to help students develop a growth mindset. So moving from that fixed brain of, I'm just not good at this, to this is challenging, but here's strategies and here's ways that I can overcome those obstacles. We also have self-management as one of those core competence areas. And self-management is the ability to manage your behaviors and your emotions. So this we see a lot with issues related to executive functioning. So things like working memory, flexible thinking, self-control or impulse control. This tends to be a struggle for a lot of people. And with working through social emotional learning, it's ways to develop that through stress management techniques, helping develop self-motivation so that students and adults aren't necessarily just motivated by what do I get for doing this, that good old-fashioned bribing kids to do something. It's instead developing that intrinsic motivation in order to accomplish a task or to engage in a form of positive behavior. It also relates a lot to goal setting. So what do we want our students to achieve, and how do we get there? And then the ability to delay gratification. So when I think of delayed gratification, I think a lot of those videos that were shared on a lot of social media, probably about a year ago, of recording a small child, a toddler, a young kid, giving them a marshmallow and telling them, if you wait 1 minute, I'll give you a second marshmallow, but you can't eat this one until I come back. And then just watching to see how the kids would react. Would they eat that marshmallow, or would they wait knowing they could get 2 marshmallows at the end? So that's that idea of delayed gratification. The next part in the core competence areas is social awareness. And social awareness is a person's ability to understand multiple perspectives and to be able to empathize with others. It also is really important in being able to understand very diverse social norms. So recognizing that we are a very diverse nation, we have so many different beautiful cultures represented. It's being able to understand that you might not understand everything, and to recognize that and to appreciate some of those different social norms. The fourth part is our relationship skills. With social emotional learning, we want to have students develop strong relationship skills so that they develop healthy and supportive relationships. This is also really important in students developing a lot of communication skills, their ability to complete teamwork successfully. I know that from my own experience in teaching, I often had students who would just prefer to do things alone because they lacked some of those skills that are needed to work within a team. So a lot of that is being able to collaborate with others, respecting those differences in opinions, looking at different viewpoints, and then being able to resolve conflicts in appropriate and positive ways. And then also being somebody who can stand up for others and not just necessarily a bystander. And then the last part is responsible decision making. So teaching strong social emotional skills and social emotional learning helps students to create ethical and safe behaviors, and to really evaluate the benefits versus the consequences of many of their choices. And they do that through making different judgments based off of having analyzed the data or information, or kind of evaluated what's the good, what's the bad, and then using those critical thinking skills, hopefully making decisions that would benefit themselves, that help with the well-being of their family, their community, their school. So all those components of just being a really good citizen. So with these core competence areas, there's a lot of thought on different ways that this can be incorporated into a daily educational practice. And how to incorporate social emotional learning, we're going to look at it through 3 different ways. And then I'll be showing examples of how to use that with Snowflake on addressing some of those social emotional learning. So the first part is with explicit instruction. So this could be lesson activities in which you directly teach a particular skill set. And for this, I'm going to share with you from the Snowflake community. So I did a search in the community for social emotional learning, and I want to highlight one of our Snowflake users, not just because I had the privilege of working with her, but she's a really great educator, and she's developed an entire curriculum really of fantastic lesson activities that relate to different components of social emotional learning. So these lesson activities by Laura Finnegan are really great in teaching students some of those, what we still call kind of soft skills, and helping them develop better social emotional intelligences. So she has activities on compassion, kindness, gratitude, respect, empathy, honesty, self-control, perseverance, self-confidence, and cooperation. And I'll just share one very quickly. I looked at empathy earlier, and I looked at self-control, and they were really cute too. So these are designed for elementary students. And I believe this one might start with a video first. So we have a read aloud from a book, and then using that short story with students. So this is The Most Magnificent Thing. using that short story, having students drag and drop the tiles to show, is this an example of perseverance or of not persevering? So this would be an example of that direct instruction of taking a concept of social emotional learning, perseverance. I like to call it grit when I was working with my middle schoolers, and having them, directly learn about that concept and then see examples of that. So in that explicit instruction, you have not only just having the skills directly taught to the students, but also then giving them follow-up opportunities to reinforce some of those skills as well. So I'm going to go back and show that page again. So that was social, emotional. I believe I may have had the subject. No, I kept the subject open. So that was the lesson on perseverance. And then another example, I really enjoyed the empathy one. So again, shout out to Laura. These were really great lesson activities. And this is just a really good way to directly teach some of those skills to your students. Again, being beneficial for an elementary level classroom. But so many books that students read have a lot of these social emotional intelligences built into the theme or the lesson within the story. And this is a really good way to just have them reflect on that. So they would show empathy or does not show empathy, and then they could have those examples. So if I were using this lesson activity in my own classroom after having the audio book, or if I had the hard copy of the book, reading that with my students, in addition to having this lesson activity that we could use on my interactive panel, I would also likely open my panel into multiple zones, and then using one of the whiteboard applications, have students brainstorm other ways that are examples to show being empathetic versus not being empathetic. Maybe have them reflect on their own experiences, and if they're willing to share, maybe share that of times that they felt they hadn't been shown empathy, or maybe the times they felt they did. So just a way to kind of really relate it back to their own experiences. And then they'd have that model to always reflect upon as they continue forward in their education. I'm going to go back now to my lesson activities. So that would be for our explicit instruction. You're directly teaching the students about a particular concept, and they're following up with opportunities to reinforce that. The next way to incorporate social emotional learning is to embed it into your content. So with this, I think a lot of, I was a social studies teacher, so I often would use different Socratic seminars in my classroom. So being social studies and having taught the ancient world and taught American history, I had a lot of opportunities to talk about historical events and to have students think about the perspective of the people who were involved in those events. Why did they do what they did? How did their decisions affect other people? How would it have been different if they chose, this option instead of that option, or this action instead of that action? So it was a way to really incorporate some of those critical thinking skills and being able to have that social awareness of understanding different perspectives, of understanding that my worldview is shaped by my experiences, and how can I learn more about the experiences of others to broaden that worldview. Now, obviously, that was very social studies specific, but we can see this being used often in English language arts classes, reading classes, as well as even in your maths and your sciences, by having students think out loud their thinking process. So when they are solving a math problem, having them think about, how did you get through steps 1, 2, and 3 to achieve that answer? How did you overcome the challenge of maybe not understanding that one part of this equation? So kind of thinking about their own thought process and thinking about how they can help overcome any of the challenges or struggles that they might have while they're learning it. So that idea of, perseverance, of grit, of conquering things that are difficult. And then the next way is by modeling by the teacher through student-centered interactions. So I'm going to share with you kind of two different examples of ways that this can be done. The first, directly using our Snowflake content, using the polls feature. So I thought about a lot of my colleagues who are still in kind of a hybrid model, or some of them have had to transition back to remote after having been in person, and vice versa, how they are still trying to maintain those relationships and those connections with students, and to really check in with those kids. And the challenge seems to be, I don't know how my kids are feeling. And I thought polls would be a really good way to engage in some of that just emotional check-in with your students. And not necessarily the emotions of how you feeling today, but the emotions of what was challenging, or what did you enjoy about the lesson, or what are you looking forward to in the next lesson? What direction do you think our learning is going to go in? So I did a little sample poll and had my students, which was just me from a multitude of devices, answer the questions in poll. So I did one as a multiple choice. So with poll, this feature, you can use this on any web-enabled device. You have the opportunity to have it displayed on the interactive panel at the front of the class, or if you're using remote instruction, students can just join on a poll with a web code, a web address or a QR code. So it's a really easy way, and any web-enabled device can be used. So when I was teaching, my students were allowed to use their cell phones to participate in our poll. So we have our multiple choice question, and this was just a little focus check. How do you feel about your learning space? So not necessarily how are you feeling, about yourself and your emotions, but what about the environment around you? Are you focused? Are you a little distracted, or can you not focus at all? And then students would just choose one of those options, and then I, as a teacher, would be able to see the results, and it would give me an idea of, okay, I've got some kids who are a little bit distracted. What do I need to do to help shift that focus? Are they distracted because they all just came back from PE and they're super sweaty and hot and they need a second to cool down? Maybe that's when I, as a teacher, would need to bring in a little mindfulness and breathing exercises. Or are they distracted because some big event happened and their attention is focused on that event and they want to talk about it and maybe need to process whatever it is. So it gives you an idea of just where students would be. For this particular poll being multiple choice, I kept the answers without any being marked as correct. So then that way it could be just a true poll of gauging where students were at and how they were feeling. And with this poll as well, I did keep it so that my students, as all of our polls, their names are anonymous on the screen, but I can download the CSV results and then see which of my students responded. So if I had one student who said they can't focus at all, I can go back and I can check later who was that student, and then maybe I can meet with that student and figure out what was going on that made it so that student could not focus at all. Another poll question that would be really great to use is our text questions. This would be students have the ability to respond with a short answer text. They can also respond using emojis. So you could even ask your students, send me an emoji of how you're feeling today, or how you thought the lesson went, or how your behavior with the substitute was yesterday, or whatever it may be. Or in this case, what was challenging about today's lesson? So I imagined this was a math lesson because that's something that I have challenges with and I have to kind of work really hard to understand. So I had my students respond, and then now as a teacher, I can look back and I can figure out where were my students struggling and what do I need to maybe devote a little bit more time to reteaching. And then the last question type I used was the draw feature. And this was just a really fun, kind of silly way to have students connected with social emotional learning. It doesn't always have to be like this idea of like being super deep with students. Sometimes it can just be like really silly, and giving them an opportunity to just start to feel comfortable with you and developing those relationships. And relationships don't develop immediately, and they don't develop into like these super deep relationships right off the bat. So it's a good way to kind of set things up to just be a little light and silly. And then students can help kind of build that. It helps with students building that connection. So here we have our little draw how you're feeling today. And then the draw background was a little blank face. And then students could doodle their emotions over the drawing itself. And again, as a teacher, I can export the data so I can see which individual students answered. And if I can say, okay, this one's crying, I wonder what's going on with that student today, and have an opportunity to go check with them. Or oh, the student looks like he's, being really silly today. Let's check in and see how, what's going on that's making him silly. So that is using polls as a way to do some of that emotional check-in being modeled by the teacher. And then the last way that I will share with you today is using some of the lesson activities. So this is kind of that in between with similar to what we saw in those lessons by Laura, where it was directly being taught as well as kind of just being modeled. So I did 2 quick little lesson activities. And in these lesson activities, I have the seats lesson template. In this, I've set it up so these numbers do not snap to a grid. And my thought process was the numbers could be assigned to each student, or depending on the culture that I've created within my classroom, if my students felt comfortable, maybe their faces, or even have my students maybe create like their own little avatar and then use that, all of the numbers would be replaced with pictures, and those would represent my students. And then I could just pull this up onto my board, and at the start of class, have my students come in and just drag their numbers to however they might be feeling that day. If they're ready to rock with our lesson, I know that they're ready to go. If they're a little nervous, if they're confused, whatever it may be, this would just be a real quick visual of how my students are feeling and how they're doing. I've seen similar ideas done with like Post-its, where students would take their Post-it and stick it to kind of an emotional thermometer in a way, to show how they're feeling about something. And this would be a really great digital version of that same idea. And then the next lesson activity is with kind of developing a growth mindset and with using positive affirmations. And with that, this would be students could select a card. They would pick 3 different cards, and then they could read the affirmation either out loud or silently to themselves 3 times. This would be an activity that I would maybe use in my classroom if I saw that my students needed a little bit of a mental break from the instruction that we were doing. You might remember some of our earlier webinars about brain breaks, which I was a huge fan of when I was teaching. And brain breaks are just based off of neuroscience and the time that students need in order to process new information before they're ready to absorb more content. And it's a way to structure your daily instruction so that you're not just giving information. You're providing students with an opportunity to kind of step back, think about what they've just learned, digest it a little bit, and then practice the skills or the content. And with my own instruction, I always set up in my classroom on our agenda a part of our agenda that told them exactly when they were going to have their brain break. And oftentimes I would tell them what our brain break was going to be. Were we going to do like a quick little online workout? Were we going to do some deep breathing? Were we going to just like get up and wiggle? Or were we going to just have like a moment of kind of quiet, calm? So whatever, we might have needed that day. I wish that I would have incorporated more affirmations. I think that this is a really good and positive way to have students just start developing more of that growth mindset, and developing some of that self-awareness as well. So there's our little examples of ways that you can use some of the Snowflake lesson activities in developing and incorporating social emotional learning into your own classroom. So I gave a lot, and I think we probably all now need a brain break. So I'm going to give a second to open up for any questions that you might have about social emotional learning. If there's anything I could explain further.
So thank you, Danielle, for
Yes.
another good lesson this evening for us all. And I'm checking, just giving a couple of wait seconds to see if any questions come in. And we have one question that asks, could you go a little bit more into detail about what you mean by a brain break? It's not something we've used in our school system.
Of course, I love brain breaks. So brain breaks are referenced a lot with neuroscience, and neuroscience being, the way in which we are able to learn. And many students, depending on their age level, can only take in so many minutes of direct instruction and new content before their brain essentially becomes overwhelmed. So the science being, they're no longer able to make those connections anymore. Their synapses are kind of completely fried, and they've absorbed all that they can absorb. Incorporating a brain break is a time where you, in a way, step back from instruction and allow students an opportunity to process the new information that they may have learned. In my classroom, the way that I had taught is I would have, at the beginning of class, we'd usually have about 15 minutes of direct instruction. And that was when I was teaching whatever brand new thing I was teaching. If we were learning about, ancient Greece, or we were talking about the mummification process in Egypt, whatever it may have been, it was usually about 15 minutes of me lecturing, students taking notes, or us doing a guided reading, or whatever it may have been. And then we would pause. And before I would transition to the next part of my teaching, which maybe would be an additional concept or additional piece of skills that my students needed to learn. Before I did that transition of bombarding them with new information or new skills or new whatever, we would take usually no more than like 90 seconds. And my students would have an opportunity to typically get up out of their seats. They would move around. I did a lot of Snowflake lesson activities that allowed for that. I think I have some examples. So there we go. So there's some brain break examples. These are in the Snowflake community as well. So this one would be, my students would get up and we'd have 90 seconds. They would take turns flipping over the card, and it would be a little movement exercise we would do. So it might be do 5 jumping jacks, or let's do 10 squats, or something to kind of get them up and moving. Most middle schoolers, most students in general, can't sit still for an entire class period. I couldn't sit still for an entire class period, so I would not want to make my students have sat for that long. So this is a way to just get up, get moving. And in doing that, students are allowing their brain a moment of rest, where they're able to actually process the information without having to actively think about it. So they're able to start building those new connections, storing it into their long-term memory, because now their brain has had a chance to take a breath. And then at the same time, because students are doing some sort of physical movement, it's helping bring oxygen back into the body. It's helping release some of those endorphins. It's helping get some of those wiggles out that students would often get after sitting for a period of time. And from my own experience in teaching, after we did our very short brain break, I knew that my students were ready to move forward with the next part of the learning, and they had better focus, better retention of what we were teaching or what I had been teaching. Instead of me just pushing information, gave them a chance to just process that information.
We have one last question, and that was in the social emotional learning listen activities that you were looking at, written during that time. How were they tagged according to subject, or what would you search for?
So from the community, I did a general search. So I was in the keywords and I did social emotional learning. And I believe I kept the subject open for this one, but you can see also they are tagged as personal, health, and social. So if you wanted, I obviously searched the keywords too. You could just search through that subject, and that would bring up some of the lessons as well. So these are just 15. Most of these are from Laura Finnegan, again, one of our really great Snowflake users and fantastic teachers. But you can also do really anything if you're searching like emotions, feelings, mindset was another really good keyword, because that idea of a growth mindset is definitely tied into social emotional learning.
Sounds good. And Laura said you're too kind, Danielle. Well, that looks like it is all of the questions that we have this evening. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. If you have any ideas of things you'd like us to talk about, feel free to email us at jr@nuitec.com. And it looks like we have somebody writing a comment. Laura, thank you. She said great job as usual, Danielle. So thank you, Laura. Thanks everyone for dropping in, and we'll see y'all next month. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.